Hello and welcome back. Today we are going to be doing a video essay on a combination of innovation and industrialization, and to a lesser extent culture. Now this is going to be a more theoretical sort of video essay, going over various topics of how to fix and improve systems, unlike my freight video, which was more practical, trying to operate within the way that current systems exist in order to abstract transportation. If you are interested in that sort of thing, it will be in the video links down below. But instead what we are going to be talking about is more theoretical, for fixing the way that universities work, literacy works, and also technology, specifically industrialization, and the process of industrialization all ties together. Now, for this, we're going to have several critiques, but just briefly, the main ones are going to be, first of all, the university does not tie in with the design philosophy of Victoria 3, which is to have everything emerge from the pops, or have systems that are emergent and all tied together that relate to pops. The pops will become more politically active as they get richer. As you get certain laws, you will be able to get more pops politically active, / be able to suppress certain pops. They can get discriminated against. They will agitate for particular movements. All these types of things tie together in a way that is kind of the tapestry of Victoria 3, which is the interplay between pops. Universities don't really work that way, and technology research doesn't work that way. You can have 10% literacy and 300 universities as China, and you will be all caught up with tech with everyone else, despite the fact that your population is illiterate. And universities, as they act and as they function, are just kind of a sink for money. You just dump in money and you get spat out research. And there's no sort of subtle, emergent sort of overlay that has anything to do with pops. And so one of the main ideas behind the systems is to introduce this into the system of achieving research, have it be more pop dependent, and have the populations be more important themselves. A secondary critique that is more kind of on the nose of how the game works is that the cost of industrialization is entirely research, which is to say that when we get a new PM, when we, for example, research atmospheric engine, we can just swap everything up immediately and there's no secondary cost. Swapping PMs is free, which means that the cost of this research is the entire cost of reforming the economy and increasing industrialization, and this is just a very strange abstraction. And so this is going to be the next thing that we look to handle, is that we are going to divorce innovation and research from the actual prospect of industrialization and upgrading to higher PMs. One of these is to combat the issue of China, for example, being so easily able to field an enormous economy, be all caught up in tech, and be able to turn everything on willy-nilly. There are also going to be some historical aspects that we take a look at. In particular, there's going to be two, which is how industrialization started. This is going to tie in with the freight to some extent, but a large portion of what created the kind of features for industrialization was the creation of export markets and the creation of an exploitative way of dumping goods into other markets, or utilizing other countries as a means to produce demand for regular goods as opposed to luxury goods. Previously, before industrialization started, mass-producing goods wasn't considered at all viable. Instead, it would be better to just produce singular, very, very nice goods and to try and sell those. So we will talk about that, but we will also talk about how the process of industrialization is bad for the first mover in some sense down the line, and how Great Britain, for example, at the end of the 18th century, started to fall off in terms of industrialization, mainly because there was a cost to upgrading to a newer PM, like a condensing engine pump, and this was one that was not worth bearing for the capitalists in Great Britain, and so they fell behind using old technology for achieving things, and it was only through their advantages in freight and finance that they were able to maintain strength in the later part of the 19th century. Part of this will be abstracted in terms of the freight video that we talked about, but part of this we will also create costs for the process of industrialization that are both cultural, that are going to be present in terms of culture, construction, and also innovation. And so that is the main thrust of the rework that we are going to be proposing, is doing all of these things together. So for this section, we are going to be setting the stage in terms of some historic analysis, leading on the book Industry and Empire, reading through some of these passages. If the historic analysis doesn't interest you as much, you might want to skip forward to the next section. So, if anyone has ever read the book Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith, one of the things he emphasizes as an important element of being able to develop economies is specialization, and particular to the end of specialization, in order to specialize in something, you have to be able to sell a lot of that thing. So, if you're a local blacksmith, you can't just produce only nails because there isn't enough demand for nails. But if you have a lot of ability to transport goods, you could sell nails locally and then sell nails to the town, down the road a bit or down the canal. So to that end, transport and communications were comparatively easy and cheap. This is talking about Great Britain, since no part of Britain is further than 70 miles from the sea, and even less from a navigable waterway. As we'll be able to see, it is the creation of markets that creates the demand that makes you want to mass produce anyways. You don't want to mass produce a good if you're not going to be able to sell it. The technological problems of the early Industrial Revolution were fairly simple. They required no class of men with specialized scientific qualifications, but merely a sufficiency of men with ordinary literacy, familiarity with simple mechanical devices, and the working of metals, practical experience, and initiative. Now, currently this basic literacy / initiative, I think, is captured in game in terms of qualifications, but one of the problems with qualifications is you only care about it in a binary sort of way, which is that if you have the qualifications, you suddenly don't care about it at all, and if you don't have the qualifications, man, you really need them in order to employ buildings up, and instead it's not a, greater literacy or greater initiative on behalf of our pops that allows us to do more and more industrializing. It's just a threshold that once you pass it, you stop caring about it. Very often in game, once you get to a literacy of maybe 30-40% and an SOL of maybe 10, you really don't ever have to worry about qualifications again, except if you are heavily discriminating. And so this is to say anything that contributes to qualifications once you pass a certain threshold isn't particularly useful. But what we want is a system where it continues to drive, the underlying system towards greater and greater innovation as we get more literacy, as we get more qualifications, and as our pops get to be more enterprising. So there is this curious example of the steam engine specifically, because the steam engine was neither conceived of nor initially implemented during the Industrial Revolution. In fact, it was developed far, far, far earlier. In the 1st century AD, it was first conceived of out of a device that would use heated air steam to spin a wheel, a turbine of sorts, and then later it was actually implemented in an organ inside of a church in 1100 AD. And it is this interesting sort of phenomena that raises the question, well, if it wasn't technologically driven, what sparked the Industrial Revolution, and what created, the system by which mass creation of goods became so important? And Industry and Empire kind of offers us a little bit of an explanation. The puzzle lies in the relationship between making profit and technological innovation. It is often assumed that an economy of private enterprise has an automatic bias towards innovation, but this is not so. It has a bias only towards profit. It will revolutionize manufactories only if the profits are to be made greater than in this way than otherwise. But in pre-industrial societies, this is hardly ever the case. The available prospective market, and it is the market which determines what businessman produces, consists of the rich, who require luxury goods in small quantities but with a high profit margin per sale, and the poor, who, if they are part of the market economy at all, which they are not in the abstraction of Victoria 3, because in terms of how they are abstracted in Victoria 3, when they are kind of starting out, they are part of not the market economy, but this sort of subsistence good economy. And the poor, who, if they are in the market at all, and do not produce their own consumer goods domestically or locally, have little money, are unaccustomed to novelties and suspicious of them, unwilling to consume standardized products, and may not even be concentrated in cities or accessible to national manufactories. There we have kind of the transportation. If they're living in rural areas, how are they going to get the goods? Is someone going to go out and peddle to them? That's an expensive prospect. Later, the sound businessman, if he has a choice, will produce very expensive jeweled timepieces for aristocrats rather than cheap wristwatches. And the more expensive the process of launching revolutionary cheap goods, the more he will hesitate to risk his money in it. Okay, so how do we create this opportunity for mass production to be profitable, which is the essence of industrialization? Why are we not just bespoking up a whole bunch of luxury goods for the hyper rich? Well, there are two schools of thought about the question. One emphasizes chiefly the domestic market, which was clearly by far the largest outlet for a company's products, and this is already abstracted in game. This is abstracted in game in terms of the subsistence farms, in that these guys will not stimulate the market very much, these guys being the peasants. The peasants get paid in an abstraction called subsistence output. If you look at their pop income, you will be able to see subsistence output. And this money isn't wages that come from their owners, but is instead reflecting the fact that they are producing a lot of their own goods. And so you could think of this subsistence output as stuff they are producing themselves. If they are producing this themselves, then this will not be reaching the market, and it doesn't actually reach the market in terms of buy orders, at least not very much, which means that we can't mass produce and sell to these guys because they are currently not demanding goods. This is abstracted if you kind of look at the census data. If you look at peasants and you look at this figure here, you will see that there is a consumption factor multiplier 0.05 for peasants. Only 5% of their buy orders reach the market. And so this is what depresses your ability to mass produce, and this is already represented in game. But the second factor I think is underrepresented in game, which is going to be this other stresses foreign or export market, which was equally clearly far more dynamic and expendable. Now that's kind of a weird quote, because I think they meant to say equally important, but far more dynamic and expendable, or expandable rather, not than expendable. And because it's so expandable, this was one of the ways in which Great Britain created an absolutely massive market when it was the first one to enter, the prospect of mass production. And they exported textiles and all other sorts of things all across the world, and it is through the creation of these markets in which they would dump goods to that they were able to create demand back home, which allowed for profitable enterprise. If we go on later, we can see just how much happened in the 1700s, which was when Great Britain started industrializing. Between 1700 and 1750, home industries increased their output by 7%. So that's this domestic market that we're talking about, which was still a larger share of what was going on. The movement of peasants to not being peasants, creating more demand by these more regular workers, it expanded by 7%. Export industries by 76%. And that is a much, much larger figure. So this is a much larger percentage increase. It's not as big a pie as the domestic market. Between 1750 and 1770, which we may be regarded as the runway for the industrial takeoff, by another 77% and 80% respectively. And it is through the creation of, this expansive export market that they were able to achieve, enough demand that mass production became profitable relative to kind of the bespoke sort of creation of buy orders. So the reason for this extraordinary potential expansion was that export industries did not depend on the modest natural rate of growth of a country's internal demand. They could create the illusion of rapid growth by two major means: capturing the series of other countries' export markets and destroying the domestic competition within particular countries. We see this abstracted in game, by the creation of, or the deindustrialization of the East India Company, for example, where they get put into an extraction economy, but previously it was abstracted in terms of industry banned, where Great Britain did in fact force them to come off of their own textile industries. That is by this political or semi-political means of war and colonization. The country which succeeded in taking over other people's export markets, or even monopolizing the export markets of a large part of the world in a sufficiently brief amount of time, could expand its export industries at a rate which made industrial revolution not only practicable for entrepreneurs, but sometimes virtually compulsory. And this is what Great Britain succeeded in doing in the 18th century. This is what created, their sort of first mover advantage. And once they start moving, it's important to emphasize, once the pops start depeasanting, now they are part of an internal, or they are part of a more globalized economy, and they're no longer, in their huts producing their own goods. And so once they get moved out of the peasantry and are part of the participant of a regular market, it's not necessarily essential that this export sort of market is maintained, but for the creation for enough demand in order to get a larger enough percentage of the economy into the creation of manufactories and such to pull the peasants out from the subsistence farms. This is where the export was critically important. Later, the result of this century of intermittent warfare was the creation of the greatest triumph ever achieved by a state up until that time: the virtual monopoly among European powers of overseas colonies and the virtual monopoly of a worldwide naval power. Moreover, war itself, by crippling Great Britain's major competitors, a critical element which I think is underappreciated in terms of the game's sorts of abstraction, the ability to cripple your other country's ability to influence markets. Moreover, the war itself, by crippling Britain's major competitors in Europe, tended to boost exports. Peace, if anything, tended to slow them. And so this is an element of the abstraction, the creation of globalized markets in order to further industrialization is a critical element. We addressed this quite extensively in the freight video, but this is one of the things, is we need to have a sort of demand for goods in order to industrialize. One of the summarizing paragraphs of this chapter reads, "Behind our industrial revolution there lies this concentration on the colonial land and underdeveloped market overseas, the successful battle to deny them to anyone else. We defeated them in the East. In 1766, we already outsold the Dutch in China trade. We defeated them in the West. By the early 1780s, more than half the slaves exported from Africa," shifting over here, "and almost twice as many as those carried by the French, made profits for British slavers, and we did so for the benefit of British goods. For some 3 decades after the Spanish succession, British ships still bound for Africa still carried many of the foreign, including Indian, goods. From shortly after the War of Austrian Succession, they carried overwhelmingly British ones. Our industrial economy grew out of our commerce, and especially our commerce with the underdeveloped world. And throughout the 19th century, it was to retain this peculiar historical pattern. Commerce and shipping maintained our balance of payments and the exchange, and this is the falling off of their industrial efforts, and the exchange of overseas primary products for British manufactories was to be the foundation of our international economy. Him using our and we, of course, because the author is in fact British. Okay, so how do we implement this notion that markets are driving industrialization? And before we get to that, we have to talk about how exactly the system is going to work. Currently, with innovation, you only spend it to research new technologies. And you'll notice some extra technologies here because we're on the Morgan Rote mod, because it'll help for explaining stuff, visually. But what my proposal is that it's flat regardless of how big your country is. This is a flat cost of innovation to research every single technology, and it's irrespective of how big your country is. And this is just not a very good abstraction. Instead, it should scale with the cost of your country, which is why the proposal is that every single technology, or most technologies, or some aspect of the technologies will have not only a cost to research them, but a cost to maintain the benefits of that technology, and that cost will be borne out in innovation, and that not only will it cost innovation to maintain, but there will be a secondary cultural layer that gates how much innovation that you can commit to, upkeeping particular aspects of, your country or your technology or this sort of thing, and that these will resemble, roughly speaking, political movements. Instead, you will have a cultural spirit for your nation. So for example, if we have a particularly like jingoist nation or nationalistic nation, it might make it easier for us to maintain military technology. And so the swapping up of military PMs, moving on to more disciplined and more trained recruits will require innovation as you attract, the brighter minds of your nation in order to fulfill this goal. And they want to go and enter this goal because they have, that particular sentiment, or that sentiment is strong in your nation. Now, notably, we're not going to talk extensively about every single cultural option we've thought about, but as an example here, Prussia might have really high jingoism. And this might allow them to, upgrade PMs much better. Not only that, you could have something like a, military experience or military tradition, like how it is in EU4, that this scales with innovation investment, and this innovation investment is gated by your jingoism. So a jingoist culture would be able to make use of this and would be able to funnel the innovation that they produce into it. Okay, so we would have a lot of additional costs with innovation. Well, the way that we would generate innovation would no longer be in universities. It would instead be at POPs. And we'll talk about this a little bit more when we talk about universities. But what you would do is you would have, roughly speaking, a cultural trait of innovativeness, much like you would have a cultural trait of jingoism, and that it would be a cross-section of how big the POP group is in terms of how much innovation you produce, how innovative that pop group is, where you would probably have more innovative groups, in the Intelligentsia, for example. And then you would also have a cross-section of what the literacy of the rate of that pop is. So a highly literate population would produce a lot more innovation for you to be able to commit to all these types of investments that you would want to make in order to maintain the benefits of your technology. So just having the technology isn't enough. Because, fundamentally speaking, all the technologies get unlocked for everyone as soon as they're invented, because some guy from Great Britain can come over to China and be like, look, I found this great way to operate a mine. But it doesn't matter because you can't fully implement it. And so the gate is now, your ability to implement it is gated by both your innovation as well as your culture. Another example of this, that in terms of what you can do, I think is really interestingly pushed in the Morgenrot mod, where we have the Academy of Arts, the Academy of Science, and we have sports and tournaments, and we have all these sorts of things. Well, if you have a culture that is musically inclined, let's say, then a lot of your innovation would end up going to music, right? Because what your culture is throttling where your innovation goes. So as you generate more innovation, you'll have it going to music. Now, you might not like this, you might like this, you might be able to control it to some extent, but the idea is that, the musical culture, let's say Austria, will be better at developing music and do this sort of thing, and we would be pushing, the development of music with our innovation. And in this sense, you would not only also gain a system by which the implementation of technology is not just this flat rate, like research amount that doesn't scale with the size of the nation, and this doesn't make sense, but you would not only gain a system that, scales with the size of your country, but also you would have a system that is more nuanced, and your country can be shaped in different ways because you could have different cultures, something resembling political movements, something I know not what, because it's something that's a little bit abstract right now. But you would be able to differentiate between countries in the start condition while still keeping the game sandboxed. And I think that a cultural system would be really, really neat, but it's beyond the scope of this video. But in particular, you would be able to have, for example, you would be able to have Prussia start jingoistic, like culturally, let's say, and then they would, be more militarily oriented. Their innovation would get pushed in that direction, and as a result, they would have certain outcomes, and there would be things you could do to change your culture. And in that sense, because you can change your culture, it's sandboxy, but the start condition for each nation could be made different as the result of culture. Like Great Britain, maybe they're very economically oriented, maybe they're very industrial oriented. In particular, Great Britain ruled the high seas. They were nationalistic as well, and you have a cultural overlay here that will look different than, let's say, Austria, which maybe Austria, as we suggested, is more musically oriented in this type of thing, and that this would be a certain start condition for them, such that they can achieve certain outcomes that look different, but are still sandboxed because you can shift and change your culture over time. It's not something that is like locked in a bonus that is unique to your country. Like they have a unique interest group, and this is locked in, and the benefit you get here is one that is different from other countries. Instead, you would have a different start condition in regards to what your culture looks like, something that could shift over time. And in this way, Paradox would be able to maintain their design philosophy of complete sandboxness, but also give unique start conditions and unique ways of playing that would revolve around, okay, what should I do with this particular culture, or how can I lean into this particular culture as things move along? Now, I don't want to get too caught up talking about culture, because I think that's another video for another time, but I do think that an important element is that culture not only gates what your innovation can be dedicated to, but also determines your buy orders, and that there's culturally dynamic buy orders. Currently, your pops just consume the same type of basket of goods, no matter what, no matter who they are, no matter what they believe, no matter what their profession. It just depends on their wealth level, and that entirely informs their buy basket. I think there should be a cultural influence on what pops consume. So let's say you have a very jingoistic culture, they might start to buy a lot of guns and be more likely to buy guns in order to fulfill their luxury needs, or as part of their culturally dynamic need, they will just spend guns. So you will have an additional portion of your buy basket that is culturally determined buy basket. Also, if they're musically oriented, they might buy instruments, and that this would be something that they could buy, although adding new types of goods is going to be very, very hard on performance, so that's not necessarily something that we're interested in. If they are more intellectually oriented, they might want publishing, and this could be some place or some way in which you would consume more of these goods. In turn, having bigger industries in these various sectors that are culturally related would further influence your culture and create feedback loops, and would allow you to influence other countries' cultures as well. So, for example, if you export publications to some other country, you're going to make them tend to be more culturally oriented towards the types of cultures that, as part of their buy basket, they have publishing. And also, this would interplay with laws, because what you can consume, or maybe what you can put out, or the nature of your publications, would be, for example, influenced by free speech. And in this way, you create a dynamic system that interweaves with, the pop's consumption elements, as well as production, as well as trade, because you can influence other cultures. You can have, an enmeshing of cultures via trade, because you start exporting more and more goods to another person's economy. And maybe that also, to some extent, informs buy orders, not just their culture, but if there's a lot of cheap instruments in this market, maybe the pops start getting more and more musically inclined, and that there could be emergent sort of behaviors from this, and that, very importantly, this is tying into kind of one of the basic and important elements of Victoria 3, which is that pops consume goods, and we can instead have them consumes goods in a dynamic sort of way, so that they will buy goods that are related to their culture. Okay, so how do we pay an ongoing, innovation cost with our industrial efforts / production tech? And I think that this one is one of the more straightforward ones to come up with kind of a model for how this should be paid, but almost all these techs give various production methods. They give various things you can use in your buildings, and so what should happen is there should be an innovation cost whenever you construct a building, and this innovation cost should scale with the production method being used, and that this should scale with the degree of specialization, or the degree of wage multiplier that these laborers have. So if you take a look at the average annual wage, you will see shopkeepers and laborers, just two. If we kind of turn on up, we will have different types of laborers, and you will see the machinists get paid 50% more than the laborers. The engineers get paid 3 times as much as the laborers. The more specialized the workforce required in a building, the more innovation it requires to get that building online. Furthermore, upgrading from one PM to the next should also cost innovation, and I think if you construct an in-game system for modeling this, that you might as well add construction onto that as well, because it would also cost construction in order to bring these buildings up. It shouldn't be free to upgrade production methods, and this is kind of an important detail, specifically in the case of Great Britain, because Great Britain had a lot of, very, very nice mines in the early 1800s, but those nice mines were on earlier PMs, and they never really upgraded them, or this was one of the reasons why at the late 1800s they were kind of stuck on stuff like atmospheric engine pump, and it wasn't economically as viable to upgrade to condensing engine pump, for example, and instead they stayed on this because the economic cost was too great, and this sort of slowing down and this being backward, you see this in history. It's also why, for example, the United States, the railroads in the United States are not as nice as Japan and China. The reason being is Japan and China implemented the later technology, and completely digging everything out and redoing it is very, very expensive. And so you would have a system by which being the first person to arrive would mean that on a tech or building out buildings earlier would create this slow-moving weight behind you, where it has an increasing cost over the cycle of the entire building's life cycle, where if we build an iron mine on picks and shovels, and we have to upgrade it 3 times to diesel pump, the cost is considerably more than just the 400 construction cost investment, not to mention the fact that we will be paying multiple times the innovation cost of upgrading, because reformatting, retraining workers, all this would cost a significant intellectual effort. Now, upgrading a PM should cost less than building out of its entirety. Maybe the figure is like 50% to upgrade, maybe it's like 25%. It should be less, but there should still be a cost to upgrade from one PM to another. So there are 2 cultural traits that I kind of thought of that I thought would be reasonable to inform our ability to throttle both turning up PMs and also constructing new buildings in terms of the innovation that we could dedicate to those, and that was industriousness and also entrepreneurship. And I think that these should also be further filtered through particular professions being more likely to grow or inform that culture. So because profession is like an underlying system that is deeply entrenched in how Victoria 3 works. It informs to a large extent politics, and so it could also inform culture. Now, for industriousness, I thought that this would be primarily engineers and machinists, but to a lesser extent, academics and perhaps also even laborers. And then also for entrepreneurship, I thought that this would be primarily capitalists, but also to a lesser extent, academics, engineers, shopkeepers, aristocrats, and very, very small amount farmers. And that these systems could be bolstered, these cultures could be bolstered in such a way that it would allow us to kind of simulate some of the historical elements that we have discussed up until now, which is that I think that high prices in your market should inform industriousness. As prices get higher and higher, your pops look for more and more ways to do things better and to provide more goods, because there's such a huge demand for the good that you would want more of it. Namely, when you had an enormous demand for mass-produced consumer goods, this is what created the kind of impetus for mass production to happen. And so the PMs, or upgrading the PMs, is more attractive as the prices go up. But secondarily, for entrepreneurship, I thought that a good one to inform that and to increase that culturally would be volume of trade relative to market buy and sell orders. So the more buy and sell orders you have in terms of trade, the more you would be relative to the market, the more your entrepreneurship would increase. And I thought a good explanation for this was that, as you're changing hands, changing money in hands more often, you're more often thinking about how can I make money, where are opportunities for arbitrage, what's really good opportunities for investment, how can I peel more money off, and these types of things, and that these two together would actually dovetail very nicely in terms of the play pattern of exporting to create good, large consumer good markets, in that if we do something like export a ton of furniture or export a ton of clothes, kind of per the Great Britain example, we would both raise prices, increasing industriousness, and also increase trade volume, increasing entrepreneurship. And in this way, we would be able to open the floodgates of our ability to upgrade our PMs. And by being able to upgrade our PMs, we would gain an advantage, in terms of the production of goods that would further help us out. Now, I also think, on top of this, with this system, because there's an additional cost for turning up PMs and using later PMs, I think the PMs should be even stronger at the later stages. But what you would see when you turn up the PM is this would also decrease prices, right? Because as you can turn up PMs, there was a secondary pressure against you because the PMs are more efficient and this lowers prices. And so this would decrease industriousness or decrease the trend towards industriousness unless you can find markets with which to bear the lower price good, because as you increase efficiency of PMs, this generally tends to decrease prices unless you can stimulate buy orders. And so by doing this, it becomes more and more critically important that you find areas in which you can try and dump goods in order to keep your industrialization efforts going, at least until you can get your domestic kind of economy up and going. And in this way, this is kind of the kickstart that we saw in the example of Great Britain historically. But once we get, enough local demand that we can get our goods expensive enough, then we will still be able to be industrious, and we will still be able to upgrade PMs, or be better able to, because our throttle for that particular thing is more open. And I think both of these cultural elements, it's not necessarily that these are the only things that should inform these cultural elements. There should be a lot of things that make you more entrepreneurial, but that these two specifically coincide with the element that we're trying to simulate, which is that the kind of key element for industrialization, particularly early on, was these creating these export economies, or finding new markets via exporting of goods, such that mass production became lucrative and possible to engage in. I also think there are some interesting feedback loops that can tie into how we mentioned that buy orders would be informed by culture, in that, okay, for turning on the furniture manufacturers, we're throttled by industriousness and entrepreneurship, but perhaps for specific types of manufacturers or for specific type of goods, other types of cultures could inform innovation contribution. So we might need innovation to be throttled specifically in furniture manufacturers by the two we mentioned, but perhaps an artistic culture will throttle innovation investment for instrument workshops in particular. So if you have an artistic sort of culture, maybe you have a hard time industrializing in the sense of producing clothing or producing furniture or this type of stuff. But man, oh man, can you always upgrade to the latest and greatest PM on instrument workshops, because this is what your culture cares about in particular. So maybe you have a very literary culture, right? Or they're literally literary, and you have an easier time turning up various production methods on these, because other cultures can inform specific types of PMs. And maybe with jingoistic culture, you can get arms industries up and going. And in this way, your culture can also inform economic niches that your country can engage in as a result of your culture. So maybe you're playing Prussia and you're having a hard time being able to swap up to better and better PMs. Well, maybe you start building arms industries then, because you're a very jingoistic culture, and you will be able to swap up the PMs on the arms industries in particular, and then you start exporting those arms industries. These exports, because you can produce them for much cheaper and you can flood other people's markets with them because your goods are cheaper, these exports would in turn help to increase the total amount of trade volume that you are running, which would increase your entrepreneurship, which would help you to turn up your other PMs. And so you would have different angles of ingress to try and engage in industrialization as a result of having a different culture. So maybe for Prussia, you build a bunch of guns and you export these guns, guns, and you can, turn up the guns. But maybe for someone like Austria, maybe you need to instead build a bunch of instruments and try and export those because your culture is more oriented in that direction. And there's a whole bunch of open elements here, depending on all the cultures that come into play and all the different, buildings you have and all the different consumption you can have. But the idea is that we are creating layers of elements that not only help with the simulation, but also are giving you opportunities for different play patterns based on different in different countries based on what cultures they have available, with the same aim of trying to industrialize more. It's just that you will have a different tool if you don't have kind of the ideal, very industrious and entrepreneurial sort of culture that you might start off with Great Britain. And so maybe you need to find other ways to try and achieve it, like being able to turn up your instrument workshops if you're Austria, and then use this to increase exports, and then joining the kind of globalized economy in terms of exports allows you to be more entrepreneurial, which allows you to get your industry flowing. Notably, you also this creates play patterns where you also want to deny people entry into your market. Like, you do not want to allow Great Britain to dump goods into your market, and perhaps it's only export goods in particular that you want to inform entrepreneurship rather than import goods as well, or only importing inputs, and perhaps finished goods do not contribute to entrepreneurship. So if you're trying to export finished goods and import inputs, then Great Britain, sending a whole bunch of, let's say, furniture or clothing your way is going to hurt your entrepreneurship. And so this gives you reasons to engage in sort of trade combat with them, because it's negatively affecting your culture's ability to engage in industrialization. And so this creates like finer tuned elements by which you combat other countries on an economic basis rather than just through diplomatic plays and military intervention. There is a feedback loop that I wanted to point out that also relates to the freight video we made, which is that since the cost is scaling, of innovation is scaling with the higher tier professions, but also the higher tier professions inform your industriousness, which throttles your ability to commit more innovation to upgrading these PMs. There is a feedback loop wherein as you become more and more industrialized, as you have more industry, it becomes easier and easier to turn on more industry. And so this makes it so that once you get the ball rolling, things are easier, but getting the ball rolling can be difficult. And this was a subject for a great amount of protectionism against the Great Britain during this time period, when other countries prevented Great Britain from selling steel and iron and coal so that they could produce steel and iron and coal. But also related to the freight video is that we generally had manufactured goods costing more freight, which was the abstraction we used for the transportation of goods. And this made it so that countries that wanted to export more and be more finished good oriented would need to specialize in freight more, but also that countries who specialized in freight more would be better equipped to export and this type of thing. But this fits in with the feedback loop there as well, where by acquiring, more of an international trading advantage, you are able to better kind of shape your culture in a particular direction you want towards industriousness and entrepreneurship, because you put yourself in a better position to have an advantage in the manufactured goods, and these manufactured goods have the type of jobs that orient you towards a more industrious nature as it relates to the process of industrialization. So you have multiple feedback loops that are feeding into each other within the game systems when you consider this proposition alongside the freight one that we had made a little while ago. Okay, so we now have all these new innovation demands that largely scale with the size of our country and what we're doing in our country, and it is because of this that I think that the costs of this should also scale with the size of our country, and so innovation will be gained from POPs. Instead of just being this flat cost, no matter what, in terms of implementing and gaining technology for all countries, regardless of size, so that Belgium effectively has to pay a much larger proportion portion of its economy to pay for a tech than China does. Instead, what we will be having is we will be having research come from POPs, and we will be having research come from POPs in the equation that we have above. Okay, so what we have is innovation squared times the total amount of population in a given POP times the innovativeness, which is going to be a cultural element that will vary quite a lot in its attraction based on profession, but very importantly for our consideration here, it's going to roughly 50% correlate with literacy itself, making literacy an absolute cornerstone of what you are going to be getting in terms of innovation, but it is going to affect and be based on the POPs themselves, and then this will be times by the price of education modifier, where universities, instead of giving literacy itself, they will give education, which is going to be a good that is in your market, and will have various cascading downstream effects as a result of the price of the good, the access to the good, and other things that the university is involved in. Now, to kind of unpack this a little bit, just to give some examples here in terms of how much innovation we might be getting. For peasants, this group of 1.5 million will produce about 60% of the innovation as this group of 2.5 million because it's smaller. I also think peasants in particular should have less education access based on wealth. Peasants, in terms of what they are getting, is they are getting subsistence output, and this subsistence output, when they are getting paid, is a big portion of their income, and they use it, and it's reflected in the idea that they are producing their own goods at home, they are not going out and about to achieve them, and this is, they are not entering a market, they are not entering a public sphere, and I think that this represents for me a significant amount of isolation that would be detrimental to innovativeness, and also this subsistence output props up their wealth level considerably, and so I don't think that their wealth level should be at all that strong in informing their overall literacy rate, but we do have from the academia tech wealth-based education access and the empiricism tech wealth-based education access, and I think these should affect peasants specifically considerably less, as well as part of this calculation, and that you should get significantly less innovation from them overall as a result of their literacy being lower, or maybe they should just produce like 10% of the innovation, something like this. But if all other things equal, if we had a peasant that had 10% literacy, and we were comparing it to a POP with 100% literacy, let's say these bureaucrats, and we ignore that their cultures are likely going to be quite different in terms of how innovative they are, the one with 10% will produce around 1/500th of the amount of innovation as a POP with 100% literacy. So literacy, since you are squaring it, right, if we take 10% and we square it, we will only have 1%. So they would only produce 1% of the literacy, but since innovativeness is largely informed by literacy as well, this means that your population will be, let's call it half, and so rather than going to 1,000th, it goes to roughly 1/500th, and so you will be getting a lot less from having a low literacy. And so this means pushing a high literacy will be critically important, but also affecting things in various ways to increase your innovativeness in terms of your culture is going to be important. And it will vary a lot from profession to profession. The most obvious of which is that academics, all other things equal, should produce a massive amount of innovation, and choosing to orient yourself towards jobs that create more academics will allow you to have a more innovative culture. We notice here in the Morgan Rope mod, we have stuff like the publishing industries, which employ academics. We have observatories. We, of course, have the universities, government administrations. So being on a PM that informs this type of thing, or informs you having more academics in your government administrations, would make a big deal. And also arts academies are going to have academics depending on what production method you have, which makes actually upgrading your arts academy maybe something that you're interested in. But kind of taking a look at the census data and just looking at them all, we could also start caring a lot more about which POPs are going to tend to have the highest literacy. It's going to be the very rich pops, bureaucrats, clergymen, and academics are going to have the absolute most. So if we take a look at the 100% literacy rate, you will see that, of course, we have a ton of bureaucrats. If we cut out the bureaucrats and eliminate them, you will see that we have a ton of clergymen and academics. And I think that this is perhaps where we start to get a little bit more granularity, because I think the clergy are going to have other sorts of cultural agendas, like piousness or this type of thing, relative to the academics, and so you might end up getting a lot less innovation from clergymen than you would academics, but still quite a sizable amount because they have 100% literacy. If we eliminate the clergymen from here and also the academics from this sphere, we will be able to see that the remaining ones are going to largely be capitalists and aristocrats. I think capitalists, for example, should tend to be a lot more innovative in terms of the culture than aristocrats. Aristocrats are maybe more oriented towards elitism. Capitalists are about getting the bag. They're about they're more about investment than displays of ostentatiousness. It's since they are looking for enterprise and they're looking for new things with which to invest their money rather than having lavish displays of wealth, they're going to be more culturally inclined. And so even though capitalists and aristocrats will often, with that wealth-based education access, have 100% literacy, notably, you can't go over 100%, so boosting more education access from wealth is probably not going to be the way to go for innovativeness, but boosting these particular groups in a particular way is going to affect your innovativeness. So now you have more incentive to industrialize rather than being agrarian-oriented, because it's going to affect how much innovation you get in the net. If we exclude these capitalists and also these aristocrats here, we will see that we are wow. That's not exactly what I was expecting, but we see laborers in the instrument workshops have an enormous amount of literacy. I guess it's a really profitable instrument workshop where it's paying really high wages, but what I was expecting to see more of was engineers and shopkeepers, and that the engineers would probably have, for example, a large pull towards innovativeness relative to something like a shopkeeper, but a shopkeeper might be entrepreneurial, and so they might be able to positively affect, in the realm of industrialization specifically, your ability to invest that innovation into more enterprising stuff as it relates to industrialization. Of course, engineers also seem in that regard to be that type of way, but if we scroll down a little bit, we can see, groups like officers. These guys are going to tend to be more jingoistic than innovative, which can still be positive in terms of where you can invest your innovation in terms of affecting cultures and these sorts of things. And you can get a whole bunch of emergent types of patterns from the professions, which are informed, what professions you have, again, can be further informed by your culture. Going back to what we were saying, is if we have a very musically oriented culture, maybe we could get a bunch more instrument workshops, and we could have this interplay where more instrument workshops means that, coming back, I do think we had some more, not intelligentsia, but academics in these instrument workshops. And so you can see how all these layers of effects get to settle in and interact with each other, where here, if we go none and we go take a look at these guys, we do see publishing industries choosing or being able to specialize in these types of things would give you a leg up for the frame of innovation production. And just to give a bit of an idea, I think the academics should maybe be 4 times the next group's disposition towards being oriented towards innovativeness, and they will be like a backbone kind of structure, but it's really hard to get a ton of academic pops. You could see here, total in Austria, there's only 50,000 out of, our 34 million that we have here at Game Start in the Morgenrot mod. So beyond literacy and profession, I think there are 2 other things that would be good for influencing a sort of innovativeness in terms of culture, and one of them is going to be academic tradition, which we'll talk about when we talk about universities, but the other one I really think I would love to see as a sort of cornerstone of the game, and so we won't explore it in its entirety in terms of ideas for it, because this could get quite lengthy, but that is going to be the combination of media consumption and also the free speech law, and depending on what you go with this. What you have in terms of free speech should allow you to control cultural narratives more, but being more oriented towards protected speech should allow your country to become more innovative. And this should give you more interactions, a ton of things to spend authority on, and with these things, you should be able to shape your culture in the way that you want if you have outlawed dissent, but the trade-off, or a trade-off, would be it's really a lot harder to push innovativeness in your country as a result of this, because you are closed off from ideas, you're not sharing ideas, and you do not have access to kind of a more global consideration when it comes to ideas as a result of your own tamping down on the consumption of various media formats. But also, I do think that the publishing industry itself could become an entire mini-game, and out of all the things I would love to see another building for, I would love to see one for the idea of publishing. This is present in the Morgan Road mod, and we can see here, for example, they have all these different types of newspapers. Now, these just give different modifiers, and it's fairly straightforward. You know, we will have various positive modifiers, and some are better than others. I think the investment pool contribution modifier is pretty good, but it's not necessarily modifiers like this I would want to see, but instead, newspapers create cultural pressure in addition to the consumption of them. Remember the idea that we are going to have a cultural consumption buy basket that is going to be dynamic and is going to vary based on what cultures you have present, and also what goods you have present in your market. Just kind of influenced in two ways, maybe half by what cultures you have and half by what you have available for cultural consumption. So flooding publishing industries in your country might be a good way of pushing up innovativeness, but also in a sort of separate context, just beyond the publishing industries in general, the different types of newspapers or news that your country could consume can push things in a particular direction. Maybe you can set an agenda, a cultural agenda, and having a government newspaper will push people along towards that culture. Maybe a daily newspaper is just a little bit generic and doesn't push you in a particular direction. A business newspaper more towards business interests. Maybe it allows you to be more entrepreneurial and pushes that type of culture. A workers' newspaper maybe pushes class consciousness. You know, a lifestyle magazine maybe pushes more artistic and musically oriented cultures. And an investigative journalism, I don't really know what this would push exactly. I mean, we could say it pushes education, access, and qualifications, but which is the modifier it gives. But the idea is that I would love to see a massive sort of minigame in the that also plays into literacy rates as well. Your literate pops want stuff to read. They read stuff. The stuff that they read affects their culture. I think there's a ton of room here for a ton of interesting stuff. But rather than unpack it all right now, which I want to do, I think we're going to stay focused and just say this is something that can influence, the innovative degree of culture, and in particular, be very, very sensitive to what free speech law you have, such that you are either tamping down and controlling the spread of ideas, or you are allowing an open spread of ideas, which can include dangerous ideas, like democracy and dethroning kings and such. So the universities will no longer directly output innovation. Technically, they will still output it in the sense that they are employing employees, like academics, who will otherwise, as pops, produce a lot of innovation, but it will not be output of the building itself. The output of the building itself will instead output a trade good. That is to say, it is a good that will be expensive or cheap, depending on the buy and sell orders, and this trade good will be education. Education will have several uses and kind of dynamics that play into it, but the main idea is that this will be a lever by which you can, as the government, choose to over-inject or under-inject relative to your needs creating either an expensive price or a cheap price, and you will also be able to export education. The reason to export education would be to try and increase the secondary thing that universities are going to be outputting and utilizing, which is going to be academic tradition, in sort of sense of having an academic tradition, much like there is military tradition in EU4 and these types of things. This represents the degree to which you have a prestige and a following for your academics, such that you are attracting the greatest minds from around the world, making it easier and giving throughput to your universities as a sort of reward trade-off for having encouraged that within your system. The primary creators of demand for the education good is going to be your institution for education, as well as the wealth-based education access you get from technology. But in particular, this is going to change who pays for it depending on how the institution is being funded. If the institution is being funded through public schools, you as the government will eat the cost of providing this additional education, and this will make universities quite a lot more expensive. On the flip side of things, in the case of both the wealth-based education access here in academia, as well as also, if we were to implement that, it instead would be the pops that would be paying for their education. And this would have a few interesting kind of downstream effects, in that this would decrease standard of living, first of all, but it would shunt off a very significant cost onto the pops themselves, and it would make something like private schools more viable, especially because there's way more top-end value in terms of innovation. We saw that if you're at 10% literacy, you will produce 1/500th the amount of innovation as a pop that is at 100% literacy. So you get a whole lot more from being at the top end, and private schools is also pretty good at pushing the top end specifically. Also because of that effect, I don't have a number in mind, but I think each level of education should have it should not scale linearly with the demand of education. It is noteworthy, though, that, from 50% to 100%, it's only about 8 times as much innovation, something like that, that will be produced by the pop. So what I think it should be is it should be a scaling, maybe it's 50% more per level, where it's not quite, squared exponential, but you will see maybe a cost of 100 for the first level, 150 for the, 250 for the second level, right? And then an additional, 50% on top of that, where you will see something like 750 for the third level, and so on and so forth, where you are still getting rewarded for hitting those higher breakpoints, of literacy, in particular, because the margins are getting better and better for you, and it makes sense to increase education. I also think that the cost should be capped at once the pop reaches 100% literacy. And I'm not sure the best way to do that. You could tie it to the literacy of the pop themselves, where you would be creating buy orders based on the literacy, and that'd be the most straightforward way. But in particular, it doesn't make much sense if you're on public schools, and you're on public schools level where it is going to be giving you, private schools rather, where it is going to be giving you up to 2% wealth education access, and you have a pop with 50 wealth, they will just have 100% education access, at which point I don't think extra wealth for them should contribute to them paying more for education. They pay to be 100% literate, and after that they don't pay any more. This is a little bit beyond the scope of the video, but I do think it's relevant to the strategic decision-making whether to go, private schools or public schools, which is that I think there should also be a culture of class consciousness, and I think that this class consciousness culture should be informed, or part of the attraction should be literacy. And so making pops more literate, and then having them, be part of the machinists and the laborers and the engineers and this type of stuff, the workforce of those those kinds is going to increase your pull towards that culture. And maybe that's something you want to avoid. And so by having the elite class of really high standard of living pops being the ones that are the one going to be gaining access to that 100% education, you can help to lock out certain types of people from becoming properly educated. You can see here as we scroll through, as we're sorted by standard of living, we're greeted by almost entirely capitalists and also aristocrats at first blush. If we sort those out, we'll see machinists, shopkeepers, some laborers, clerks. Notably, this is partially because they're working in financial districts, they're working in sub-farms, we have homesteading. Also, the instrument workshops, I think, are owned by workers at this point in the game, so that's why they're kind of in here, but we will be seeing also quite a few clergymen and such as well, but we will have a lot less, education on these guys, and if they can't be educated, they can't rise up. And so I think adding this additional layer of culture that can be, filtered through with attraction to particular groups based on literacy, this type of stuff, creates, more emergent gameplay patterns or behaviors, and this can also be used to inform the politics in a way that I think is interesting. Pops become more politically active anyways as they become more literate, and so this is already a thing in game, but by having it inform cultural movements in addition to political movements, you gain an extra layer of complexity to the system. I also like education being a trade good, with expensive and decreasing prices, and this informing innovation. I also like this from the perspective of being oriented towards freight, where we are abstracting the costs of moving goods around, and when those costs are low, we have greater access to the market, because very often we might have, a university or a very small amount of universities, because they are more expensive to operate than they are currently. I think the cost should be generally more expensive, however that shakes out in terms of inputs or what have you. It should just be more expensive, but if the cost is more expensive and you have universities kind of a few scattered around, then what this means is that if you don't have very good access to the market, because you're not going to have a university in every single state, you will not have very good access to education. The education price will be increased locally, and so it will be more difficult for you to contribute to the innovation pool. So let's say education is being produced here in New York. Right, and then let's say we have an academic that's working in, an artistry type of job out here in North Dakota, and the, ability to get railroads and this type of stuff to North Dakota, it hasn't happened yet. Well, of course this guy should contribute less to the innovation pool because he's smack dab in the middle of nowhere. He doesn't have access to the latest and greatest ideas, that are coming in, that are flowing in from New York. He can't scaffold his level of knowledge about new ideas with the knowledge around him as a result of the inability to transport both goods and ideas. Now, you could say that this should eventually be overcome, once you get to some later production tech, like telephones and this type of thing. You could have a system where telephone and radio overcome this, or give more mappy to education specifically would be another way that you could approach this. But I think that this is a worthwhile simulation, and it also makes it so that you can choose to export education if you were so inclined, which kind of brings us into the next topic, which is going to be academic tradition. Now, we're going to present kind of two ideas for academic tradition, remembering that academic tradition informs the ceiling by which you can do research speed, the cap you will be receiving rather than literacy. And the first way is by the total number of sell orders of education in your market, plus some additional bonus for being the first person to research a particular technology, gives you an advantage in attracting the greatest minds. If you are selling a ton of education in your country, then there's going to be a ton of other academics to collaborate with. It's going to be a hotbed of, intellectual progress and this type of thing. And I think that this is a fine enough simplified abstraction where we are generating this academic tradition. Now, I think that academic tradition can be used in one of two ways. You can either have just a score that will increase just linearly, the line will go up, or not necessarily linearly, but the line will go up as far as you can crank it up, and your research speed can increase faster and faster and faster if you decide to dedicate a lot of time and effort into increasing this. Or you could have a ranking system, like you have with Power Blocks or Prestige, or in particular the company bonuses, where the person with the absolute highest score of academic tradition gets the best outcome, and no one else can get on top of that same thing, and then it will scale down with and according to who has the most academic tradition. So this is the more simplified version, but I did want to talk about and suggest, if you were jumping really deep into some cultural elements and this type of stuff, in particular thinking and looking to the Morgan Road mod, there is a lot of extra direction you could take to have this be an entire minigame in and of itself. And if we take a look here, we can see the Academy of Science, which is a feature of the Morgan Road mod, where we will have characters that are similar to agitators that act as scientists in our nation. You can see we haven't recruited any of them, but we have slots for them. We have engineers, chemists, astronomers, geologists, naturalists, paleontologists, archaeologists, physician, and anthropologists. And what we can do is we can give them jobs. If they are outperforming and outcompeting other countries, this could contribute to our academic tradition, which in turn would leave us more fit for discovering stuff on the bleeding edge of science. And we can help to fund various projects, like the ability to discover stars, send out expeditions to explore volcanoes, dig up dinosaur bones, all of these things, all as an entire game of culture in and of itself. But I think this is more of a thing that would be inside of its own cultural kind of element, and I just wanted to propose a simplified version that was just not based on any of this. You can see even here, this has a bunch of ticking sort of factors that give you more academic progress, and these could also be used to inform academic tradition. But instead, I think the simplified version tied to the trade good would be a little bit interesting, as a means of which we could inform and create this academic tradition. Notably, since the high literacy or high institution scale, the amount of demand really, really high for education, this means that the countries that would be having the most sell orders would not just be the highest pop countries. It wouldn't be anywhere close. It would be the countries that have the absolute highest literacy that would probably be winning out, and it would be organized in this way. But if you wanted to super actively push extra education, tank the price super low, this type of stuff, have a concerted government effort, you would be able to overcome something just as simply arbitrary as how a ranking system of who has the highest literacy has the most academic tradition. Instead, you as a nation could just dump extra resources into this sort of thing, and then you could also export, especially if, let's say, we are playing the East, or we're playing as Great Britain, and we are building in the East India Company, and they are not able to swap up their PMs, their production methods, as a result of not having enough innovation. Well, if we export to them education because we are so good at producing it, because we have extra throughput bonuses, because we have high academic tradition, we would produce extra education and then send our experts out to show, the people in the EIC how to use something like an automatic irrigation in order to make them more efficient. And so if we ship out to them education, remember, that is one of the inputs on innovation. We can control them having innovation, which is valuable to us if we have overseas buildings and they're not using the better PMs. Us sending out our experts to try and remedy that will be a useful thing, and also we will have to do that if they are inside of our market, or we will be compelled to be the supplier of education in the overall market, which can lead to interesting sorts of phenomena. I think I'm not entirely sure that it should be that leads to a bunch of downstream weird perverse effects. We'll have a little bit of a think on this, actually. So other people importing education from Great Britain might actually be bad for our bottom line in terms of increasing the price and making it so we have to pay more for education. But I do think this makes sense. Entrepreneurs will want to hire, and and poach great minds from other countries, and perhaps this is an abstraction for dealing with this. What is present, though, is that Great Britain will have to pay for some amount of education, but that education, if we are on some sort of free market price thing or free market option, and the academics are free to move to other areas, it would make sense that this would be something that would end up happening where they are competing for our minds and the education we're putting out. But notably, we can also tariff education. So this is a means by which, especially in thinking of the market as an extractive means of colonialism as well, we can tariff the education, keep the education internally low. This increases our innovation. The fact that other people at our market are consuming our education increases our total number of sell orders, which informs our academic tradition, these types of things. And then also, it increases the means by having countries in our market. It would increase the means by which we can enact on them in an extractive manner, because we can help to push their PMs up. I think overall, with the systems of producing a whole lot of innovation, it's going to be easier to get technologies, but harder to implement them, generally speaking, with the entire writ large system. And so by having someone in your market, you can increase their ability to not only get the research, but also implement the research. And I think this makes sense. If Great Britain has the EIC as a subject, of course the technology is going to be reaching the EIC. And they also had, a widespread effort, which wasn't necessarily as lucrative as they had hoped, of building railroads across this area. And this is a main reason why India got a whole bunch of railroads built in it during this time period. It was the result of, the technology that was kind of, in a sense, being imported from Great Britain. And I actually, after a little bit of reflection, do think that this, the fact that we can't isolate our education and that other people can siphon it off, I think that this is a fine thing. I think it makes sense. I think this is probably how other countries, early on might have to seed, in some degree, their industrial efforts with the help of great British entrepreneurs. I do remember reading about that, how they would, get someone who had implemented a system elsewhere and have them implemented in their country. And so in my mind, this makes a lot of sense. But Great Britain, by virtue of having discovered a lot of technologies initially, would have that high academic tradition initially, which gives them a comparative advantage or relative advantage in the production of education, because they, by virtue of having a high academic tradition, gain access to that juicy throughput, and so they can produce education cheaper than other people, so they will likely have it cheaper in the market, which means people will be trying to import the ideas, the education, the personnel from Great Britain in order that they might engage in private enterprise, because they need to be able to push up innovation, which is dependent on education or education price, in order to implement the latest and greatest production methods. Even if they've discovered them, they still need the minds and innovation and people required to implement the turning up of one production method onto the next. And I think that this does kind of fit in terms of thinking through the moving parts. I think that this does fit in terms of having the simulation function quite nicely, and also having the movement of ideas be tracked in this way. Now, I also think that there is another additional element, if you wanted to lean into the cultural stuff, in that it could be the case that this allows you to propagandize easier if other people are importing your education. This makes sense to me, but this is also beyond the scope of the video, just a little bit of food for thought. Alright, so let's talk about some examples that are a little bit more narrative in structure, but I hope that some of the systems we proposed will allow things to go down in this way and operate in this way and be somewhat interesting. The examples we're going to talk about are going to be Great Britain, Prussia, China, and Japan, everyone's favorites. So starting with Great Britain, really the Industrial Revolution started here. You can tie some of it to the Agrarian Revolution, freeing up laborers, and also, in a sense, depeasanting people in that front. But Great Britain expands its markets. prices in the British market rise. This increases industriousness and allows more and more opportunities for mass production to finally become a thing. Great Britain starts mass producing goods, and now that it's mass producing goods cheaper than it ever could before, what it needs to do is it needs to sell those goods. So it starts selling these goods. This increases cultural entrepreneurship in addition to cultural industriousness. This selling of goods and exporting of goods creates a new need for a much, much expanded freight system in Great Britain, where they will need to transport all the goods that they are producing, so they start dedicating a whole lot more to ports, as well as military to support their vast and expanding empire, where they are beginning to corner markets. They start to focus more, though, with naval dominance being a force multiplier for freight and for the power of ports. They start to focus more on this dominance and empire building and nationalism, and whatever empire building sort of cultural mechanic starts to creep in as a more and more powerful force relative to industriousness and entrepreneurship. But they do corner markets, and they lose competition in that regard. They gain access, free access to various places. Great Britain eventually got it on Qing with the treaty port. They have all these subjects, and things start going on. Meanwhile, Great Britain is starting to, or is exporting industrial goods as well. Stuff like steel, coal, and iron, which had happened historically to the likes of Prussia, Austria, these types of things. But now we've reached a little bit of a point where the GPs themselves, the other great powers, are starting to industrialize themselves, and what they do is they put tariffs on Great Britain. So now Great Britain cannot dump those types of goods as much, and instead they have to focus on different goods. Notably, though, they still have all these cornered markets, but they are going to focus more on consumer goods, which are the types of goods that they are dumping to the likes of the EIC in order to support this mass production. But the consumer goods, notably in terms of employees, are generally going to have less machinists and less engineers than something like steel production will have. And so this pulls them slightly away from industriousness. Let's see if we can find a steel mill here. Tooling workshop will probably work just fine. I do believe it will employ considerably more. There are some engineers relative to, the clothing industry, which didn't have the engineers. So the POPs we have are going to inform, what is going to be gated in terms of innovation investment. And Great Britain, still on the cutting edge, still on the bleeding edge, but they are becoming less and less industriousness or industrial culturally. And it becomes more profitable for Great Britain to, instead of focus on developing and upgrading all of their production methods to the latest and greatest, since they have the markets cornered and they don't necessarily need to improve in terms of their industrial output, it is more profitable for them to focus on war, to decrease the output of the other people, decrease their ability to, access the markets like India, and instead they wage war and focus on freight. We see, for example, the great ambition of the great game that gets played out, vying for dominance over Persia, and all of Central Asia, as well as Great Britain spending increasing efforts, personnel, and various resources on maintaining its control over its colony in the East India Company, and they have moved away from their roots of their resources being contributed to the process of industrialization. And also, not only that, the PMs that they have, the production methods that they have, are already somewhat profitable, and so because they're in a cornered market, they don't have to compete and all these other factors, they're focused on other things, it becomes difficult for them to turn up production methods. And instead, what their investment ends up going to is they stagnate out on lower tier PMs in a lot of their areas, a lot of their regions, and they instead focus on naval dominance and freight, and slowly they begin to wane away. Even at the height of their ostensive power, they start to become weaker and weaker, posing more of an external sort of front rather than having an industrial heartland as they did at the start of the 18th century. They become hollowed out, or sorry, the 19th, well, I guess halfway through through the 18th century. By the end of the 19th century, they are a hollowed out version of themselves, economically speaking, where their primary export is the movement of goods to other countries, such as Germany, who have begun to industrialize themselves and created strong power bases. And when they are coming in on the new PMs, importing workers and education from Great Britain so that they could turn on these things. When they come in on the latest and greatest technology, which Great Britain has access to, but they lack the means to upgrade to these PMs. And so we will see stuff like other countries outcompeting them with condensing engine pump, diesel pump, and it is only by the means of controlling markets that Great Britain is able to still hold economic dominance, at least for now, in addition to forcing coercive sorts of financial agreements, loans, these types of things, which we haven't discussed at all and are entirely beyond the scope of the video, but this is where Great Britain transitions to over the course of time, and I'm hoping that the simulations that we've proposed can in some way capture these effects, and lead to sort of these short-term orientations towards a transition towards freight, as well as the increased investment cost required on the upgrading of these PMs to have this result in this happening, for Great Britain here. Taking a look at Prussia, they are a sort of secondary mover in the industrialization game, although they have quite a lot going on for them during this time period, with the formation of Germany and all, but they receive initially, as Great Britain is starting to mass produce and build manufactories and these types of things, they are receiving these industrial goods from Great Britain, stuff like iron, coal, and also steel. But eventually, this is resulting in a large enough domestic market themselves, as they do exchange goods with Great Britain, whether they're agricultural or other inputs, or even, the type of luxury goods that would sell well in a pre-industrial market. They are exchanging these goods with Great Britain, and eventually they get enough going on in terms of a domestic market as a result of Great Britain sort of becoming involved, that they can, have more of a market, and they want to expand into industry themselves. And so what they do is they begin tariffing Great Britain, making Great Britain's exports not profitable. Great Britain doesn't have enough power to throw around to force open Prussia's market in the same way that they could force open India and wrest, unique control over their markets. And so instead they have to suffer this indignity. And then Prussia in turn imports the various technology and mines, in terms of, as it's abstracted for us, the importation of education, in order to generate more of this innovation that Great Britain will have more access to with a lower education cost, because they are the primary spot, the place to be, and they have a lot of academic tradition. Prussia is able to import from them a slight amount so that they can try and build these mines, build these steel mills and these types of things, and be able to turn up to the later and later production methods, turn these on with the innovation that they receive from Great Britain. The engineers and machinists themselves begin to pile up as the later and later PMs are received, as more specialized labor is required. These guys are enabled to in turn innovate themselves, and Prussia loses its dependence both on the goods of Great Britain and also on the knowledge and knowledge implementation in terms of the abstraction of innovation from Great Britain. They're perfectly fine on their own, but there's a key difference. They become more industrious, but they lack the ability to open up markets to the same extent that Great Britain did, although they did very successfully in Africa for a short period of time, and instead they do not receive as much entrepreneurship in their culture, but instead are industrious, and their culture also shifts, more towards nationalism and these types of ideas, as they are also busy with the prospect of unifying Germany, and perhaps less interested or focused, at least initially, on the prospect of empire building in the same way Great Britain was. So they don't quite have the same sort of liftoff in terms of being focused on and being able to dominate in the same way of focusing on freight and finance, and instead they are more internally focused and they engage in a more industrious kind of bent. We see that with the Great Ruhr Valley. I think the Ruhr Valley was over here. Let's pretend like we know where the Ruhr Valley is by just zooming out so you can see all of it. But instead, the industrial process is a bit different for Prussia, and we will see kind of a similar sort of thing as this internally more independent United States as another example where initially they are very dependent on Great Britain for creating a market by which they can export a ton of cotton, and then they eventually transition into an industrial sort of empire themselves, although we won't kind of create the same sort of narrative for the USA. With China, the old method of stacking several hundred universities in order to fully catch up on tech, and in doing so catch up on industrialization, is no longer possible. China having a massive amount of peasants, it becomes very, very expensive for them to try and implement schools which are necessary to produce the literacy required to engage in these sorts of industrial efforts, to produce the innovation, to use some of the later PMs. So while the technology for various things does arrive on their shores, it is difficult for this to penetrate inwards, part of this being difficulty accessing the market as well, especially in interior states where we will have local prices be affected by MAPI, and we will have more difficulties using freight to generate market access in the internal states. And so what we do see is a sort of more commodity orientation in China, at least initially, as well as the accepting of goods, because a lot of these, knowing that it is primarily a modifier in terms of higher tier jobs, which is informing the innovation cost, and these commodities and agricultural orientation does not have as high requirements, and so this becomes the orientation of China, and they focus on this, and they don't industrialize as much as they would like. But maybe we can engage or imagine an effort and what that would look like for China if they were trying to get started. Well, they would want to find a kind of home base of sorts in a centralized maybe location that has a ton of market access, someplace like the capital where they can produce freight in order to increase market access and add a whole bunch of universities there. We do see a unique building here, a few unique buildings, but we add universities and start to produce education ourselves, in addition to perhaps importing education from our trading partners who are dumping freight to us so that they can trade with us, importing our input goods, exporting their industrial goods, which hurts our ability to compete back with industrial goods as well. We can tariff those and start to try and build up a little bit, with some of our iron mines and coal mines, but it is difficult to upgrade these PMs as a result of them needing more innovation to get going. So, instead of enacting public education, what we do is we look to create a more concentrated workforce, use the funding from taxation all across our nation to fund private schools in a particular area, and it's in a particular area because that's where most of the wealth is, and in that area we can have education and universities that will not have to ship around to the rest of our country, knowing that we do not have the infrastructure and freight to manage that, although we do have loud cars outside, and instead we will try and produce a same sort of internal spark where we are industrializing, depeasanting, and creating the conditions by which we can produce enough innovation to more widespreadly be able to upgrade these iron mines and coal mines. But it is still difficult with the abysmally low literacy score that we have to generate any sort of innovation to get things going. And this will be the real struggle, just having this enormous mass of pops to try and get going for China. And I think with this types of of systems with all these overlaying systems, China becomes a lot weaker, which it was during what they called, the century of humiliation. Japan is a bit of a different story. See, Japan actually has an incredibly high literacy, courtesy of their journal entry, which is present in vanilla, the Terakoya system. Now, the Terakoya system interacts in a very interesting way that I think fits with a lot of these mechanics in a way that is robust. It is not the acquiring of technology that is necessarily difficult, it is the implementations of these technologies, and we see for them, what they receive from the Terakoya is minus research speed, but a ton of increased education access and education access for peasants. This is the period, the Tokugawa period has been marked by programs to assist with the education of the shogunate's population. Despite lacking an official statement, a state-run school system, the decentralized and private Terakoya, or temple schools, provide practical education to commoners across the country. And this leaves Japan more willing and able to receive technology from abroad and to implement that. Their market gets opened via war from Great Britain, and then we see the technology begin to arrive, and with that, the implementation is much, much smoother. But not only is the implementation smoother, the implementation arrives in the later sorts of tiers of tech. And so Japan doesn't have to suffer, implementing atmospheric engine pump and then upgrading to condensing engine pump. Instead, they begin the process of industrializing after condensing engine pump's already been discovered, and they have a less upfront cost or less total cost of creating a condensing engine pump mine because they didn't have to go through the pains of having upgraded it. And so in this way, they are beginning to open up and bring in a ton of European goods. They are exporting a ton of freight to Japan. They are trading a ton for Japan. Japan represents an enormous consumer market that they can use to drive their mass production. But Japan is also importing from them technology and education and means by which they can improve their nation. And notably, Japan has a very significant difference in terms of being able to transport goods. They do not have, just a fraction of their pops on a coast. If we take a look at China, as China does, having enormous sprawling population all over their nation. Instead, all of Japan is present on a coast, and it is much, much easier for them to have high MABI scores and to have good freight, and as such, it is easier for them to receive, the education, utilize the education that is being received, especially with the Terakoya system, and to implement the production methods in a much more robust way, so they are not trapped behind their massive, massive population in terms of peasantry as a result of this peasantry being much more well educated. And so with Japan's specific journal entry, it is likely that they will be much better off and able to implement stuff. And also, as far as you are creating a cultural system and you are trying to simulate what happened with the rapid industrialization of Japan, you can create extra attractions towards industriousness because there was a deep concerted effort towards this, but also you could create this deep concerted effort in terms of a game mechanic if you wanted to create sorts of cultural efforts on behalf of the nation. Japan could be an example of one being implemented historically, where you had a massive and rapid industrialization period under, I believe it was under Meiji, but I'm not 100% sure. And so we see Japan play out quite a bit differently with Qing in ways that are consistent with and can in part be informed by some of the systems and ideas that we've proposed here, and also ones we've proposed with the freight video. Since this video is already really long, I will try and be very brief in terms of the summary. I think currently the abstraction for industrialization being entirely captured in the base cost of all the various technologies to be a little bit lacking, and instead there should be an innovation cost for implementing every building, upgrading a PM, or building a new building to represent the intellectual effort required to get industries off the ground. Similarly, each other sphere ladder or tree of technology should have an ongoing innovation cost that represents, the actual implementing of the ideas having a significant cost, and in this way, technology will no longer have a flat cost, but the cost will scale with your size of the nation, with the size of your nation. At the same time, I do think that the amount of innovation you produce should scale with the size of your nation as well, and instead of being produced in universities, it should be produced by POPs directly for a variety of factors, but the two that we kind of focused in on is it should be focused primarily based on literacy, but secondarily deeply informed by a cultural element, which I think will also not only determine how much innovation you receive, but where it is you can funnel your innovation into, where you will need corresponding cultures in order to properly dedicate resources to the ongoing innovation costs of implementing various technologies, which is to say, if you are industrial oriented as a nation, it will be easier for you to turn on all your production methods and fully utilize innovation there. If you're militaristically focused in terms of culture, it will be easier for you to employ officers, get new production methods for war systems worked out, acquire new military tactics, perhaps even have something to the effect of military tradition that is informed by your culture, and similar idea with the society tech, but it is most straightforward, I think, with the production tech in order to explain, which is why I wanted to start here. Also, as a result of innovation no longer coming from universities, of course, need some sort of rework, and I propose that they instead produce education, which is a trade good, which I think has a bunch of, emergent sorts of effects created by having it as a trade good. You could trade it. It means that if you have a area with poor market access, they will have less access to education, and education will in part inform how much innovation you can produce, but it will also inform your academic tradition, which will allow all of your universities to be more efficient, and academic tradition rather than literacy will be the new gating force for what you can actively research and how quickly you can actively research stuff, representing you being on the absolute cutting edge of intellectual discovery and this type of thing, and this in turn allowing you to better attract the best minds of the era to study the particular things you want to study. And so it is with this in mind, and also the particular case of Great Britain, which started out with the Industrial Revolution, and they got on the scene first, but later lost all sorts of industrial advantages instead of moving towards freight. It is with this in mind that we kind of really wanted to produce a system that could properly simulate this, where Great Britain, even though they had all of the technologies available, struggled to implement it, and they instead focused on freight and finance because the costs of upgrading production methods was too high, and they had already cornered markets in other ways. And so this is one of the reasons why we tried to create mechanics that could properly simulate this effect. The game is Victoria 3. It should simulate, or be able to simulate, the way in which Great Britain became a shell of its former self in the later half, or the later part of the 19th century. But I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please feel free to like, comment, subscribe. It took quite a bit of effort to put in here, and, well, you've been here quite a bit of time at this point too, so shout out to you. But other than that, you guys have a good day.